Let's talk about the two things you need to do to get something that sounds like this. So basically dark, orchestral, apocalyptic music with a horror or anxiety-inducing side to it. Now, to write something that sounds like this reminds me of like Bloodborne, which is actually the style I was going for. If you play that game, you know what I mean. And basically, there's a misconception. People believe that using minor keys is enough, but actually it's not. You need to go deeper. You need to go darker than that. So I'm going to talk about the two things you need to do. This is actually, by the way, a cover of a track from a game called Sekiro, which is coming up tomorrow on PlayStation. And the cover is available right now on my Alex Mkala music channel. If you want, you can go listen to it there. I'm not going to play it all now because it's very long. But basically, first thing you need to do to write stuff in this style, to go very dark and horror, is to give up the idea of needing to write something that sounds pleasant or predictable. So for example, check out the strings in this part, the melody. The melody here doesn't really make sense, does it? It's like the rhythm is not predictable. The notes, they're not following a scale. They are following the chromatic scale. So it's like they're playing in every, like they're not bound. They play all the notes in the keys, like in the piano here, from C to G sharp. It's like, what? It doesn't really make sense. So that's usually we wouldn't never do that because this sounds dissonant. This sounds unpredictable. This is not something you could probably sing along to the first time you hear it or ever. And usually when we write music, we try to write something that sounds pleasant or sounds predictable. So basically, you need to understand when you're writing horror music or you're writing something that you want to sound threatening or super dark, macabre, or all those things, you don't need to be pleasant. You're actually writing with the aim of making people scared shitless, instead of making them feel like, oh, this track makes me feel understood. No, it's your goal to make them shit their pants. So you really need to, like, if you can actually use elements that create unpleasantness, those are your treasures. In that sense, when you compose music, there's no mistakes. You know, dissonance is not a mistake. It is if you're actually trying to write something that sounds relatable or easygoing. But if you're just trying to write music that sounds good to you, you can use dissonance, you know? And especially if you're writing horror music. Now, the way it's used here is not casual, though. You know, this melody, which, again, doesn't really make too much sense, is placed upon something that instead makes sense. So if we remove the violins, maybe you're going to notice that. Actually, let me remove another sound here, which is a cluster, which is very, very... So this is a... pretty much predictable. You know, you have this bass staccato that does the same note all the time. This is the cello, and sometimes that's, you know, it does this predictable motion, and then we have this on top of that. This could be arguable, like this is like obviously minor, it's very like dark, but it's not creepy, it's just dark. It gets creepy when you add the strange melody. Now, the melody can play like this because what's underneath that, the foundation, is actually very predictable, or is actually very like rhythmically, you can latch onto that and feel like, you know, you don't know where you're going, but you feel there's an element that is like stable in the track. There is another example of that as well, I suppose, in this bit. So in this bit, basically, I have the string ensembles, the choir ensembles, and the brass, which are split in different parts, and each one has the highest voice going higher. So to show you what I mean, maybe this French horn patch will make you understand. Wait, this French horn patch actually. This is another of those dissonant melodies that doesn't really make sense, but it increases the tension a lot. We have this same melodic line on the choir soprano here. However, if you check out the choir alto, tenor, and bass, they're pretty much doing the same note all the time. The same thing applies in the strings. The lower strings are doing the same note all the time. So it's like there's this chord which is playing rhythmically, and on top of that, there's this weird, melodic line going higher. So there's another example, like using melodies that don't really make sense, but placing them on top of something else that is actually reliable or makes sense, or is actually like it doesn't change so much. The other thing you need though is clusters. So the clusters are these guys. Now, clusters, I'm not sure if these are called effects, actually. I just call them clusters because it's easier. But basically, these are sounds which are from a library called Palette Orchestral Effects. And the cool thing about this library is that this library is like a 4-part library. This part specifically is the orchestral effects part of the library. And it has orchestral effects for strings, brass, choir, and woodwinds. And for each, there are many different categories. So for each category, there's many different effects. So you can play around with these to create an incredible amount of anxiety in your tracks or horror sound, because what these effects are pretty much ensembles playing notes in such a way where you cannot really put your finger on what tone they're playing, because like this thing. What this is actually a collection of like many different string ensembles, string players playing whatever note they want. Like each one is playing one of the same rhythm, but each one is playing a different note. So you get this. It's like when you mix all colors together, you get black. When you mix all notes together like this, you get this sort of tone, which is not defined. It's just unpredictable and weird, and that makes it kind of creepy. It's very used in horror music. And there's many, again, categories of clusters. There's the short ones, which I showed you here, which I'm using on top of like actual ostinatos. But there's also clusters in the brass. So here, in the part I showed you before, in the French horn, actually, the staccatos you heard are not normal. They are cluster staccatos, and those are from Metropolis arc instead. And they sound like this. You feel like they sound as if they're off, like they're not in tune, in tone, like it's weird. And that's exactly the sound you want for clusters. It doesn't need to feel like a very well-defined tone. It needs to sound like, what the hell is this, And the other type of cluster, you hear it in the intro actually, which is very important too. It's the sort of like atmospheric cluster, and this is where I use Palette a lot. So, for example, the intro, when you hear it, it sounds like this. Now it's quite creepy, but that's because of the clusters. And the clusters, if you remove all the orchestra, they sound like this. Which is very freaking dark. So I'm using a few categories. One is called textures, which is where this whatever choir thing was from, which is like the textures are long clusters like that. Again, they don't have a very defined tone. And then there's also like cluster risers like this in the strings here. So, I use this pretty much in the track, in the calm parts. So in this track, there's some moments like this where it goes quite big. But there's also other moments where it's quite like tame. So in the moments where it goes tame and I want to bring the atmosphere back, I use the clusters. Again, undefined notes because each member of the orchestra at that point was playing whatever the hell it wanted, and that created an aleatoric sound. So those are very important because if you remove them, you don't get that horror sound. You don't get that horror sort of texture. Like you get something that sounds minor. And again, if you do the dissonance stuff I showed you before on top of like something that has foundation, that's one way. But if you use both, that's the best, and that's what I did. That's why this bit sounds like it does, because it has like again the dissonant stuff, but also like the short cluster stabs. And that's also like the reason why the intro sounds horror is because I'm using the textures from Palette. Palette is a library developed by Red Room Audio, which was kind enough to actually send me this copy to try it and tell them what I think about it. And I highly recommend it to you guys if you want to like have these sort of sounds, because again, the categories are endless, and there has multiple mic positions and all those things. It's very, very useful. But yeah, that's basically how you create. And also the third thing you want to do is obviously pick the right instrumentation. Like Bloodborne, I read that it was written without trumpets and without woodwinds and without all the bright orchestral instruments, because what they wanted to do with the soundtrack is to have a dark sound. So basically they picked all the instruments with a timbre, which was quite dull and dark, the highest one being the violin. And also in the... So basically what I did is I went and I opened the same instruments that were used for Bloodborne in this FL Studio instance. So like the choir, the split choir, the brass, the strings and everything. And the percussion used timpani and tubular bells, and solo strings. And I tried to write something like that. And that enabled me to only use certain colors. And because of that, that's how I also got this sound. So those are the three things. First, use dissonances on top of like some foundational rhythms, which are easy to follow or are foundational. Second, use clusters, and I recommend palette for that. And third, try to pick an instrumentation which will give you a horror sound. And that's how you do it. But yeah, again, you can check out the whole track, which is very cool, at my Alex Picala Music channel. Yeah, I'll be enjoying Sekiro tomorrow when it comes out on PlayStation. But for now, I'll see you in the next tutorial.